The night the notice arrived, Elias Mercer thought it was just another scare tactic from Marla Voss. She had fined him for his fence, for the color of his front door, even for a car parked 1 foot outside the marked line. But this letter was different. It said the house would be seized within 7 days. He was already reaching for his phone to call a lawyer when the doorbell rang. A stranger stood on the porch, holding an old leather case, rain dripping from the brim of his coat. The man did not ask for Elias by name. He simply set a folder on the table and said one sentence that would change everything. If they truly wanted this house, they would have to go through him first. It was almost midnight when Elias stood alone in his living room, the lamp behind him throwing a long shadow across the hardwood floor. A white envelope sat on the table, untouched for nearly an hour, as if looking at it too long might make the words inside more real. Across the front, in bold black letters, it read, "Final notice, property enforcement action." He assumed it was another routine fine, the kind he had grown almost numb to over the past few months. But when he finally opened it and read the first paragraph, the room seemed to grow colder. Marla Voss, acting on behalf of the Homeowners Association, declared that Elias had committed what she called a serious violation of community standards, and that enforcement proceedings would begin unless the full balance was paid within 7 days. At first, the number did not make sense. The original fines had been small, a handful of citations here and there, nothing that should have added up to anything close to what the letter demanded. But buried in the fine print were layers of charges he had never seen before: administrative fees stacked on top of legal fees, inspection fees compounding on top of enforcement fees, each one multiplying the last until the total reached a figure large enough to justify seizing a home. Elias sat down slowly, trying to piece together how a few parking citations and a fence dispute had somehow become a threat against his ownership. He thought back over the months, the strange, almost absurd string of complaints that had piled onto his doorstep one after another. They had made him repaint his gate twice, insisting the shade was a fraction too dark for the approved palette. They had fined him for a guest's car parked in front of his own driveway. They had demanded he remove a security camera mounted above his garage, claiming it violated some unnamed privacy clause. Someone had walked through his backyard without warning to inspect the property. A letter had arrived citing a hairline crack in his exterior wall as a structural hazard requiring immediate correction. Each incident on its own had seemed almost laughable, the kind of story he might have told a friend over coffee and shrugged off. He had never imagined they were building towards something. He had never fought back, not really. He had paid the smaller fines without much protest, assuming Marla was simply a woman who enjoyed the taste of authority a little too much. Every citation had felt like an isolated inconvenience rather than a pattern, and he had told himself more than once that arguing over a few $100s was not worth the trouble it might invite. He worked long hours as a freelance structural engineer, and most evenings he simply wanted to come home, close the door, and forget about the outside world for a while. It was easier, he had believed, to comply quietly than to stand in a conference room arguing with a woman who never seemed to lose. But now, staring at the final line of the letter, the truth settled over him like a weight. Failure to comply may result in loss of property rights. This was not about a fence or a camera or the shade of a gate anymore. Someone wanted this house, and they were willing to manufacture a mountain out of a series of small, deliberate stones to take it from him. He rose and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look out into the wet, empty street. Across the road, a black SUV sat parked beneath a dead street lamp, its headlights dark, its engine silent. He could not see who was inside, only the faint outline of a figure behind the rain-streaked windshield, unmoving, watching. Elias let the curtain fall back into place and stood there a long moment, the letter still trembling faintly in his hand, wondering exactly how long he had been watched before that envelope ever reached his door. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet certainty was forming, one he could not yet explain, that whatever was coming had already been set in motion long before tonight. Weeks earlier, before any of this had begun, Marla Voss had seemed like nothing more than an overzealous woman with a clipboard and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was not the kind of person who raised her voice in meetings. She did not need to. Her stillness was what unsettled people, the way she could deliver a threat in the same gentle tone she used to discuss holiday lighting regulations. She liked to describe her actions as protecting property values, as though every fine and every citation existed purely for the good of the community. But residents who had crossed her before knew a quieter truth, one that was rarely spoken aloud. Anyone who defied Marla Voss eventually found themselves in trouble. She had built her position over nearly a decade, cultivating relationships with the right people, sitting on committees no one else wanted to join, until her name had become synonymous with the association itself. Newer residents assumed she had simply always been in charge. Older residents remembered a time before her, though few of them spoke of it openly anymore. She kept meticulous records of everyone's small infractions, filed away neatly as though she were saving them for a future she alone could see. Elias had crossed her once, months before the letter arrived, when she demanded he remove the security camera above his garage. He had explained, calmly and reasonably, that the camera faced only his own driveway and front door, capturing nothing beyond his own property line. He asked her directly which rule prohibited it. She had looked at him with that same composed smile and said that not everything needed to be written down for the board to interpret it correctly. It was a strange, circular answer, the kind designed to end a conversation rather than continue it, and it marked the beginning of what would become a long, quiet war. After that conversation, the fines multiplied. First one small violation, then a fee attached to it, then another inspection, another fee stacked neatly on top. Elias began to notice the pattern almost immediately, the way each complaint seemed to build directly on the last, as though someone were constructing a ladder of violations meant to reach a very specific height. He started saving every email. He photographed every letter the moment it arrived. He kept a private log of dates and times, certain that eventually the pattern would reveal something, though he still could not answer the one question that gnawed at him most. Why him? Why his house, out of every property on the street, when there were dozens of homes far more visibly out of compliance than his own? The answer came to him by accident one gray afternoon in the community parking lot, when he overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. Marla Voss stood near her car, speaking to a man in a dark gray suit, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Elias recognized him vaguely from board meetings as Dorian Pike, the association's attorney. He caught only a fragment of what Marla said, her voice low but unmistakably certain. If he does not sell, we will make sure he has no other choice. Elias froze behind the low brick wall separating the lots, his heart pounding against his ribs, careful not to make a sound. For the first time, he understood with total clarity that this had never been about rules or violations at all. Someone wanted his house, and Marla Voss was the instrument they had chosen to take it. After that overheard conversation, Marla's methods grew sharper, more deliberate, as though she had decided subtlety was no longer necessary. An inspector arrived unannounced one morning, walking the perimeter of Elias's property with a tape measure and a clipboard, photographing the fence line, the driveway, even the small mechanical shed tucked behind the garage. When the man asked to inspect the utility area at the rear of the house, Elias refused, standing firmly at the gate until the inspector left in visible irritation. The very next day, another letter appeared in his mailbox, this one citing unauthorized obstruction of a scheduled HOA inspection, adding yet another fee to the growing total. That same week, a second notice arrived, this one accusing him of failing to maintain the landscaping along the side yard, a patch of grass he had trimmed himself only 2 days earlier. He photographed the yard immediately, time-stamped and dated, and attached the images to a formal reply, though he received no response beyond an automated confirmation that his complaint had been logged. He began to notice unfamiliar cars idling near his mailbox in the early mornings, gone by the time he stepped outside for a closer look. Neighbors who had once waved to him from their driveways now offered only quick, uncertain nods before hurrying inside, as though proximity to his troubles might somehow become contagious. It was a small, isolating kind of pressure, the sort that built quietly in the corners of a life rather than announcing itself all at once, and Elias found himself lying awake at night, replaying every interaction with the board, searching for the exact moment things had gone wrong. Frustrated and increasingly uneasy, Elias called Dorian Pike directly, hoping for some clarity, some explanation that made sense. Dorian's voice on the phone was smooth and unhurried, almost sympathetic in tone, though the words themselves carried a different weight entirely. He suggested, gently but firmly, that Elias would be wise to cooperate with the association moving forward. Elias asked what exactly he was expected to cooperate with, and for a moment the line went quiet, the silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate. When Dorian finally spoke again, his answer was calm and almost kind, and somehow that made it more unsettling. Some problems, he said, are best resolved before they become expensive. Elias understood the warning buried inside those words, and rather than back down, he began digging into the history of his own property, searching for anything that might explain why it had become such a target. What he found only deepened the mystery. His lot, according to old county records, had once been part of a much larger parcel of land, connected to an older agreement whose details were frustratingly incomplete. Several pages appeared to be missing entirely from the archived file. He drove to the county records office himself, only to be told that no complete version of the original document existed anywhere in their system, a gap that seemed far too convenient to be accidental. The clerk behind the counter had simply shrugged, telling him that older files were sometimes lost during a digitization project years earlier, as though that explanation alone should satisfy him. While Elias searched for answers, Marla made an unexpected move of her own, arriving at his door one afternoon with an offer that seemed designed to end everything quickly and quietly. A real estate company, she explained, was prepared to purchase his home immediately, at a price noticeably below market value, if he agreed to sign before the week was out. When Elias asked why anyone would want to buy a house currently entangled in enforcement proceedings, Marla only smiled, the same composed, unreadable smile she always wore. This, she said, was simply the easiest way for him to make the entire situation disappear. Elias refused without hesitation, and something in her expression shifted, hardening into something colder and far more certain. Then, she said quietly, "The next 7 days are going to feel very long." He barely slept that first night after the enforcement notice arrived, sitting up in bed with every light in the house switched on, as though brightness alone could hold back whatever was closing in around him. He thought about the years he had spent saving for the down payment, working double shifts on engineering contracts, skipping vacations, driving the same worn-out sedan long after it should have been replaced, all so that he could finally own something that was entirely his. The house was not large or extravagant, but it was his in a way nothing else in his life had ever been, and the idea of losing it to a stranger's arithmetic of manufactured fees felt like losing something far larger than 4 walls and a roof. The morning after the enforcement notice arrived, Elias hired a local attorney, hoping for reassurance, or at least a plan. The attorney studied the paperwork for only a few minutes before delivering a single, urgent instruction. Do not sign anything, no matter what they offer or how reasonable it sounds. He explained that the entire case against Elias relied on an unbroken chain of violations, and if even one link in that chain could be proven false or improperly documented, the whole structure built by the association might collapse under its own weight. It was, he added, an unusually aggressive approach for a homeowners association to take, and in his years of practice, he had rarely seen a board move this quickly toward outright seizure over what amounted to cosmetic infractions. Elias spent the following days poring over every letter, every citation, every email the association had ever sent him, searching for the crack the attorney believed had to exist somewhere. He found the first inconsistency buried in the dates. One official record claimed he had been notified of a violation on a Friday, yet the email timestamp proved beyond doubt that the notification had actually arrived the following Monday. Another fine, he discovered, had been calculated and issued before the inspection meant to justify it had even taken place. A signature on one of the board documents looked subtly different from Marla's usual handwriting, though he could not yet say with certainty what that meant. It was progress, but it still was not enough to stop what was coming, and the clock on his 7 days continued to run regardless of how many inconsistencies he uncovered. Marla called an emergency meeting that same week, standing before the assembled board members and painting Elias as a habitual violator who had repeatedly ignored the community's standards. Several members nodded along, persuaded by her confident tone, while others sat in uncomfortable silence, unwilling to challenge her openly. When Elias arrived, he did not raise his voice or make a scene. He simply asked, calmly and directly, to see the evidence supporting the claims against him. Marla told him he was not in a position to question the board's decisions, and Elias replied that this was exactly why he intended to question them. The room fell into an uneasy hush. Marla declared that the enforcement process would proceed regardless, and Elias turned and walked out without another word, aware of every eye in the room following him toward the door. When he arrived home that night, exhausted and uncertain, he found a small, unmarked envelope slipped beneath his front door. There was no name, no return address, nothing to indicate who had left it. Inside, a single handwritten line waited for him, and he read it twice before the meaning fully settled in his chest. You are looking for the right thing, but you do not yet know where to find it. He stood in his doorway for a long time afterward, envelope in hand, wondering who in this quiet, manicured neighborhood already knew more about his situation than he did, and how long that person had been watching from somewhere just out of sight. 2 evenings later, exactly as it had happened in the very first moment of this story, the doorbell rang while Elias sat alone with his thoughts. He opened the door to find an older man standing on the porch, calm and unhurried, despite the cold rain falling steadily behind him. The stranger did not offer pleasantries or a lengthy introduction. He asked only one question, his voice low and deliberate. Are you Elias Mercer? When Elias confirmed it, the man studied the house for a long moment before speaking again. I believe you are about to lose it, he said simply, and something in his tone made it impossible for Elias to close the door. The man introduced himself as Gideon Vale, though the name meant nothing to Elias at the time. Gideon set his weathered leather case on the small table by the entryway and opened it carefully, revealing a thick folder of aged documents sealed with an official stamp from a local government office decades old. He lifted the folder out and placed it gently on the table between them. Elias leaned closer and saw, printed clearly at the top of the first page, the legal description of his own property. Gideon watched his reaction before speaking again. "Marla Voss does not actually want your house," he said. Elias asked the obvious question, and Gideon's answer landed with quiet weight. "She wants what lies beneath the ownership of it." Elias offered him coffee, more out of instinct than hospitality, and Gideon accepted with a small nod, settling into the chair across from him, as though he had sat in that exact spot many times before, though of course he never had. He studied the room for a moment, the modest furniture, the stack of engineering textbooks on the shelf, the framed photograph of Elias's parents standing in front of a much smaller house decades earlier. "There is a particular look," Gideon said quietly, "that a house gets when someone has actually worked for it, rather than simply bought it and moved on." Elias did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing, and Gideon returned his attention to the folder between them. Gideon explained, patiently and without exaggeration, that decades earlier this parcel of land had carried a special legal right tied to an adjoining stretch of property, one that had never been formally dissolved. If the original documentation still held any legal force, the association's entire enforcement strategy against Elias could be fundamentally invalid from the start. But there was something even more unsettling buried in what Gideon revealed next. He was not simply a passing stranger who had stumbled upon this mystery by chance. He had once worked directly with the land's original owner, and he had spent years quietly searching for exactly this file. Elias asked why, after everything, Gideon had chosen to bring it to him now, tonight, of all nights. Gideon's expression grew distant, almost regretful, before he answered. "Because I made a mistake once before," he said, "and this time I refused to let them make it again." Then he reached into an inner pocket of the case and withdrew one final document, older and more fragile than the rest, bearing a signature written in faded ink. He turned it slowly toward Elias, and when Elias saw the name signed at the bottom of the page, the room seemed to tilt slightly beneath him, the past and the present suddenly colliding in ways he had never anticipated. Neither man spoke for a long moment, the rain tapping steadily against the window, as though even the house itself understood the weight of what had just changed. The document Gideon had produced turned out to be far more significant than Elias had first realized. It contained an old agreement between the property's original owner and the organization that had eventually evolved into the modern Homeowners Association. Buried within its careful legal language was a single clause that changed everything, stating clearly that the association held authority to enforce only certain specific categories of violations, and explicitly forbade the use of accumulated administrative charges to construct an artificial debt capable of stripping someone of ownership. Elias read the passage twice, his pulse quickening with each word, while Gideon watched him in silence, letting the weight of it settle. Together they spread the documents across the table, comparing page against page, and it did not take long before another troubling detail emerged. The version of the agreement currently used by the association differed from the original in one crucial way. An entire paragraph, the very clause protecting homeowners from exactly this kind of manufactured enforcement, had simply vanished from their copy. "This," Gideon said quietly, tapping the missing section, "is precisely why they needed your house." Elias still did not fully understand, until Gideon unfolded an old survey map and pointed to a faint dotted line running behind the property. If ownership of Elias's home passed into the hands of a particular real estate company, Gideon explained, a private access route running through the area could be legally restructured, dramatically increasing the value of every surrounding lot connected to it. Marla was not enforcing rules to protect property values, as she so often claimed in meetings. She was protecting a far larger transaction, one that depended entirely on removing Elias from his own home. When he asked what exactly Marla stood to gain from all of this, Gideon hesitated only a moment before opening a second folder. Inside was a record of a financial transfer, routed through a small consulting firm, and the name listed as the recipient was unmistakably tied to Marla Voss herself. It was a significant discovery, the first real thread connecting her actions to personal gain rather than community interest, though Gideon cautioned that it still was not enough on its own to prove wrongdoing in any formal sense. Documents like this, he explained, could be dismissed as coincidence by anyone determined to look away from the truth, and Marla had spent years cultivating exactly that kind of willful blindness among the people around her. He warned Elias firmly against confronting her too soon, before they had everything they needed. When Elias asked what they should do instead, Gideon's answer was simple and deliberate. Let her say it herself. In the 2 days leading up to that meeting, Gideon and Elias worked late into the night, organizing every page into a sequence a room full of strangers could follow without confusion. Gideon insisted on a specific order: the founding agreement first, then the missing clause, then the survey map, then the financial trail, each piece building on the one before it, so that no single board member could dismiss any part of it as an isolated coincidence. He taught Elias to answer only what was asked, never to fill a silence with more information than necessary, because a nervous witness who talks too much, he said, often hands their opponent the very rope needed to pull them back under. Elias practiced his questions aloud in the empty living room, while Gideon listened from the armchair, correcting his tone whenever it edged toward anger, reminding him that certainty, delivered calmly, unsettled people far more than shouting ever could. Marla called what she intended to be the final meeting, the one where the board would formally approve the enforcement action against Elias's home. Dorian Pike arrived with a thick stack of prepared documents, and Marla carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone certain she had already won. Elias walked in beside Gideon, and the moment Marla's eyes landed on the older man, her composure cracked for just an instant, a flicker of recognition passing across her face before she could smooth it away again. She asked, sharply, what exactly Gideon was doing there. He replied simply that he had come to attend a meeting, and when she demanded he leave, he declined without raising his voice. Elias did not argue or interrupt. He asked calmly that the board read through the original clauses of the agreement one by one, aloud, in front of everyone present. Marla began answering in circles, her usual polished language suddenly slower, less certain, while Dorian tried repeatedly to steer the conversation back toward the list of accumulated fines, insisting that the board should focus only on Elias's record of non-compliance, rather than old paperwork with no bearing on current procedure. Elias placed the original document on the table in full view of every board member, and the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. One member leaned forward and asked pointedly why their own copy of the agreement was missing that exact page. Marla claimed it was an outdated version no longer in effect, but when Gideon calmly asked her to prove that claim with any supporting record, she had nothing to offer. Elias then presented the timeline discrepancies he had gathered. Several fines issued before the violations they cited had even been confirmed by inspection. Serena Holt, the association's secretary, sat quietly through all of it, her expression growing more troubled by the minute until something inside her seemed to give way. She turned to Marla directly and said she had signed off on records, claiming a full inspection had taken place. Marla insisted that it had. Serena asked, her voice trembling slightly, why then the inspection date listed on the record fell after the date of the citation itself. Marla said nothing. Around the table, the silence stretched long and heavy, and everyone in the room understood that the trap, quietly built over weeks, had finally closed shut. Later that evening, once the meeting had adjourned in confusion rather than resolution, Elias finally asked Gideon the question that had been sitting with him since the night they first met. Who are you, really? Gideon exhaled slowly and told him the truth. Years earlier, he had served as legal counsel for the original owner of this land, back when a group of investors first attempted to acquire the entire surrounding parcel. A single clause buried within the founding agreement had stood directly in their way, protecting the land and its rightful owners from exactly this kind of maneuver. Not long after, the original document mysteriously disappeared from every official file. Gideon had believed, for a time, that he had successfully protected his client's interests. But eventually the land was divided, parceled off, and reorganized into what would become this very homeowners association, and Gideon considered it his personal failure that the protection he thought he had secured had quietly been erased instead. Over the years, board members changed, memories faded, and the truth of what had once existed slipped further into obscurity. He had watched from a distance for a long time, unwilling to involve himself again after everything it had cost him the first time. Marla, he explained, had been the first person in a long time to try reviving that old investment scheme, though this time she had chosen to pursue it far more carefully, hidden beneath layers of routine enforcement and community bylaws. Gideon had spent years quietly tracking scattered fragments of the original file, waiting patiently for the moment someone connected to the land would need it most. When he learned that a new owner named Elias Mercer had become Marla's latest target, he knew the moment had finally arrived. Elias asked why Gideon had not simply approached him earlier, the very first week the fines began appearing. Gideon's answer was steady and unflinching. Because handing someone a weapon before they know how to hold it only gives their enemy the chance to take it away again. He had needed to see whether Elias would keep records, whether he would ask questions instead of simply paying and walking away, before he could trust him with the truth. Then Gideon revealed the final piece of evidence he had been saving, the original appendix establishing ownership rights, proving unmistakably that the association never possessed the authority to pursue enforcement in the manner Marla had chosen. Yet one crucial gap remained. They still needed proof that Marla herself had known this all along, that her actions were not simply misguided but deliberate. And as it turned out, they already had it. A legally recorded voice memo from an earlier private meeting captured Marla saying, plainly and without hesitation, that if the original file ever resurfaced, they would have a serious problem. It was the single sentence capable of unraveling everything she had built. Outside the clubhouse that morning, before the second meeting began, Elias sat in his car for several minutes, watching residents file in one by one, some of them glancing his way with expressions he could not quite read, curiosity mixed with something close to sympathy. Gideon knocked lightly on the passenger window and slid into the seat beside him, saying nothing at first, simply letting the quiet settle between them, the way it often did before something important. When Elias asked if he was nervous, Gideon shook his head slowly. "Nervous is what you feel when you are unsure of the outcome," he said. "I have not been unsure of this outcome in a very long time." Together they walked inside, and the meeting resumed the following afternoon, though by then the atmosphere in the room had changed entirely. Marla tried once more to regain control, accusing Elias outright of fabricating the documents in front of them. Gideon responded calmly, requesting that the county archive numbers on each page simply be cross-checked against the official record, a request Marla could not reasonably refuse. Dorian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly beginning to sense that the ground beneath his client had started to give way, and for the first time since taking the case, he said noticeably little in her defense. Elias distributed copies of the full file to every board member seated at the table, giving them time to read in silence. Serena, still visibly shaken from the previous meeting, discovered an internal email she had somehow overlooked before, one in which Marla had written about returning the house to the right buyer, rather than resolving a violation or protecting the community. Not enforcing rules, not protecting property values. A buyer, Dorian asked, quietly. Exactly who that buyer was supposed to be, and Marla offered no answer. Elias read the name of the real estate company aloud, the very one Marla had tried to convince him to sell to weeks earlier, and the room went completely still. Gideon then revealed the financial trail connecting that company to a consulting firm that had previously advised the association on unrelated matters, the same firm listed in the transfer he had shown Elias days before. Marla attempted to explain the connection away, describing it as a routine business relationship, but each attempt only tangled her further in her own contradictions, and several board members exchanged uneasy glances as her explanations grew increasingly difficult to follow. Finally, one board member rose from his seat and stated plainly that he would not vote to approve the enforcement action. A second member followed almost immediately. One by one, the votes against the seizure began to accumulate, until it became clear the outcome had shifted entirely. Dorian quietly gathered his papers and stepped back from the table, no longer willing to continue defending a case that had visibly collapsed. Marla looked around the room, meeting no one's eyes, and understood in that moment that she had lost control of the situation completely. But one final piece of the story remained. Elias had discovered Marla's own signature on a supplementary document the association had never made public, one that, if proven authentic, could expose her to personal legal responsibility rather than allowing her to hide behind the collective authority of the board. He placed it gently on the table in front of her and asked a single question, his voice steady, without anger or triumph, only quiet resolve. "How badly did you want this house?" Marla stared down at the page for a long moment. When she finally looked up again, the composed smile she had worn through every previous confrontation was completely gone. Marla did not leave the building immediately after the vote. She sat alone at the far end of the long table for several minutes after everyone else had filed out, staring at the documents scattered in front of her as though searching for some remaining angle, some sentence she could still twist in her favor. Elias paused near the doorway and looked back at her once, not out of cruelty, but out of something closer to recognition, the understanding that she had likely once stood exactly where he now stood, certain and untouchable, before someone or something had taught her otherwise. He did not say anything to her. There was nothing left that needed saying. In the days that followed, the matter was resolved not through confrontation, but through careful, deliberate process, exactly the way Gideon had always intended. The board formally voted to cancel the enforcement action against Elias's property, and every fine connected to the disputed chain of violations was suspended pending a full independent review. The association's attorney quietly withdrew from the case, unwilling to continue defending a record riddled with inconsistencies that could no longer be explained away. Within weeks, Marla Voss was forced to step down from her position as board chair while an internal investigation ran its course, her once unquestioned authority dissolving as quickly as it had been built. Some residents who had once feared crossing her now spoke openly about their own strange run-ins with the association, encouraged for the first time to compare notes rather than suffer quietly and alone. Elias never sought revenge, and he never raised his voice again after that final meeting. He asked for only one thing in return: that every ownership record and every founding document connected to the community be made fully available to residents from that point forward, so that no one else could ever be caught in the same quiet trap he had nearly fallen into. Serena took on the responsibility of rebuilding the association's records from the ground up, determined that nothing would ever again slip so easily out of public view. She spent weeks combing through old filing cabinets and digital archives, cross-referencing every document against the original county files Gideon had finally returned to their rightful place. Gideon, for his part, personally delivered the original founding documents to the county archive, completing a task he had carried with him for the better part of 2 decades. Before Gideon left for the final time, Elias asked him one last question, quiet and sincere. "Did you finally accomplish what you set out to do all those years ago?" Gideon considered the question for a moment before answering with a faint, tired smile. "Not exactly," he said. "I only corrected an old mistake." Elias walked him to the door, and when he returned to stand alone in his living room, everything around him looked exactly as it always had. The same fence stood outside. The same front door remained unchanged. The same small camera still watched quietly over the driveway. Nothing about the house itself was different, and yet everything about how it felt to stand inside it had changed completely. Before driving away that evening, Gideon left one final envelope resting on the porch railing. Inside, Elias found a complete copy of the original founding document, along with a short handwritten note in the same careful hand he had come to recognize. "Ownership," it read, "is not only something written on paper, it is something that must be defended whenever someone tries to take it from you." Elias stood there a long while, reading the line again and again, the rain finally beginning to ease outside his window. He thought back to the night Marla had warned him that the next 7 days would feel unbearably long, and for the first time since this had all begun, he allowed himself to smile. Those 7 days had come and gone. The house was still his. Elias later learned, through a brief and almost apologetic conversation with Serena, that Marla had not acted entirely alone, that the real estate company at the center of it all had approached her years earlier with promises of a percentage tied to every lot affected by the proposed access route, a sum large enough to explain why she had been willing to risk everything to see it through. Serena admitted she had trusted Marla completely for a long time, signing whatever was placed in front of her without asking the kinds of questions she now wished she had asked from the very beginning. She told Elias she intended to stay on with the association, not out of loyalty to anyone, but because she wanted to be one of the people who made certain nothing like this could ever happen again to anyone else on the street. Elias told her that was enough, that people were allowed to learn late as long as they learned at all, and something in her shoulders seemed to relax at hearing it. Several weeks later, the community bulletin board outside the clubhouse was quietly replaced with a new one, and Marla Voss's name no longer appeared anywhere on it. In its place, a new and transparent set of governance procedures had been posted, drafted with the direct involvement of residents who had once felt powerless to question decisions made behind closed doors. Elias walked across his front lawn one crisp morning, glancing briefly at the small camera still mounted above his garage door. This time, no one arrived to demand it be removed. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, and he glanced down to find a short message waiting from Gideon. "They will not try again," it read. Elias typed back a simple reply, "I know." He slipped the phone into his coat, turned the key in his front door, and stepped inside, the porch light glowing steadily behind him against the gray morning sky. Far down the quiet street, a black SUV eased away from the curb and disappeared slowly into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the faint hum of an engine fading into silence, and a house that, at long last, truly belonged to the man who lived inside it.